Chapter review for the new textbook for the year. We'll try to do these for every chapter. We're reviewing chapter 2 right now, so hopefully I can give you in 8 to 10 minutes a summary of some of the key things you should remember and be able to discuss from chapter 2. The first topic of section 1 really is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was our governing document from 1781 to 1789. It was passed by, approved by the Continental Congress in 1777. And then went into effect in 1781. The main thing to remember is why it failed, because it did fail. So you think about the weaknesses. The Congress couldn't tax under the Articles. They couldn't regulate commerce under the Articles. There was only one branch of government, that was Congress. So those things were problematic. It's difficult to pass laws, almost impossible to amend. Those things led to failures. Not to mention the other economic failures that were coming around the United States in the 1780s, in part due to some of the weaknesses of the document itself. If you think about any positives of 1780s, the states were giving more rights to people, increasing the number of people that could participate, and the federal government was expanding through the Northwest Ordinance and creating a way to expand the country in the future. As a result of the Articles' failures, or the impending failures, Founding Fathers met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. They were generally a group of wealthy white men that were concerned about the direction of the economy and how it impacted them. So as the convention got underway, there were three main plans that we always kind of keep separate from each other. The New Jersey plan, the Virginia plan, and then the Connecticut plan. New Jersey plan, think of small state plan. New Jersey wanted a plural executive. That was unique. They wanted the executive to have the authority to choose the judicial branch. That was also unique. But what separated New Jersey from Virginia, New Jersey wanted a single house legislature in which every state was equal. Virginia, on the other hand, wanted a bicameral legislature where the votes were based upon population. They thought that legislature should also choose the executive and the judicial branch members. That disagreement brought us to the Connecticut plan, where they brought those different elements together. In our bicameral Congress, the House makes the people of Virginia happy, or the supporters of the Virginia plan happy, and the Senate makes the people from the New Jersey plan and their supporters happy. We got some other compromises out of the Connecticut plan and the Great Compromise. That's a 3/5 compromise, and the slave trade compromise that you should also be comfortable with, that helped bring other parties that were disagreeing with each other together. The one thing that they pointed out in the textbook, as we kind of get into more of this in subsequent chapters, at the meeting when they talked about individual rights, there were three phrases brought to you in chapter 2 that were the only three individual rights originally expressed in the U.S. Constitution. And so pay attention to these phrases, Latin in origin, a couple of them. The first one is, it says in the Constitution they cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Right? If they suspend the writ of habeas corpus, what that would be doing is not giving you your day in court, not informing you of what you're being charged with. Right? The government does not have the right to do that in peacetime. They also cannot issue bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is when they actually declare that you're guilty without ever giving you your day in court. So those things you're protected from in the original Constitution. And your last original protection was you're protected from ex post facto laws. Ex post facto laws after the fact. They cannot create laws and punish you for violating them before they were actually statutes on the books. So those were the original protections. I highlight that because always remember there was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. Those are the only freedoms. As we look at the document itself, we recognize that they highlight this idea of separation of powers. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about division of powers. You have to recall the difference between separation of powers and division of powers, even though the language is very similar. When you use the phrase separation of powers in government, we're talking about the three branches of government, right? Executive, legislative, and judicial. All three of the plans that we talked about earlier are representative of this idea of we need to create three branches, separate branches that have different authority. Congress makes the laws, the executive branch enforces them, the judicial branch interprets. By separating, giving different levels of authority, you're creating a system in which all power doesn't reside in one single location like we had under the Articles. We'll get into that more later. In addition to that, separation of powers naturally transformed itself into a system in which we have a system of checks and balances, where one branch has the authority to check the other two. So you should be able to recognize and name off the top of your head different ways the legislative branch, for example, can check the president. They can impeach the president. They can override his vetoes. They have control of the money. All right, those are things that they can do. The president, on the other hand, can veto bills from Congress. Right? The president is commander-in-chief, so even if they don't declare war, he can still send the military out. So there are different things that are in the Constitution that represent ways that one branch can restrict the others. Finally, kind of as an element of the original discussion of the Constitution, when you look in Article 1, and we'll get into that in specific detail, there are different types of powers. You should recognize the language and examples of them. We'll see much more of this in Chapter 3, but this ideas was presented to you. First off, know that expressed and or also known as enumerated powers are powers in Article 1 that are specifically listed there. Congress shall have the power to regulate interstate commerce. It says it word for word. They have the power to do it. Congress shall have the power to make treaties. Congress shall have whatever power they've got listed. And you can look in Article 1, Section 8, you'll see a listing of them. Anything specifically listed is an expressed or an enumerated power. Those powers differ from what are known as implied powers. Implied powers come from the last section in Article 1, Section 8, or the last line where it says, Congress shall make all laws they deem necessary and proper. That necessary and proper phrase is known as the elastic clause because it gives Congress flexibility to make laws that aren't specifically listed, but ones that they can try to grab some meaning or connect with perhaps those expressed powers. The next thing we looked at in the document of the United States Constitution within Chapter 2 were 3 different articles of the Constitution. We looked at Article 5, 6, and 7. Article 5, you should be comfortable with the amendment process. In Article 5, they tell us that the amendment process is a 2-stage process. We go from proposal to ratification. Proposal takes place at the national level. You can propose an amendment with a 2/3 vote in the United States Congress or through a national convention called by 2/3 of the states, but it happens at the national level. If that occurs, then it goes to the states for ratifications. Ratifications is if it has to get through ratification to get added to the United States Constitution. You can ratify an amendment through 2 processes also, either through 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of state conventions. So if 2/3 of Congress proposes it, it can go to 3/4 state legislatures and become added to the Constitution if you get that level of concurrence and agreement. We've done that 27 times in American history. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause tells us if there's tension in our federal system between the federal government and the state governments, who's going to win or how do we solve that conflict? The Supremacy Clause gives us 3 things that are the supreme law of the land. Number 1 is the United States Constitution itself. Nothing contrary to the Constitution can supersede the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the land. Number 2 on the list as far as power is federal laws. Any laws passed by Congress fall just below the United States Constitution as far as superiority, and then treaties are the 3rd thing. The idea of Article 6 is any state constitution or state law that runs contrary to those 3 items above it, a treaty, a federal law, or the Constitution, will not win in court. All right? Those federal documents, those federal laws and Constitution itself will win out in court because of Article 6. And then Article 7 explains the ratification process. The ratification process, our founding fathers decided to have this document ratified through state conventions instead of state legislatures, and they said we should have 9 out of 13 states approve it before it could become the official new constitution of our land. All right, so make sure you know those 3 articles. The founding fathers had a little disagreements whether this was the best option, and so there started to become a battle, a written battle, if you will, between Federalists and Anti-Federalists as far as should this Constitution be ratified through these state conventions. What we got into during the chapter and through the foundational documents are a few different essays that were written in favor and opposed to. So the first one that we saw was Fed 10, Federalist Paper 10. There's a few things that you should recognize. It kind of always comes back to a couple main ideas. Number one, Fed 10 is about factions, factions, factions. Madison is talking about factions and how they exist and how a government should be able to react to them. As a specific quote that we should remember from Fed 10 says, "Liberty is to faction what air is to fire." What Madison is saying is, if you give people freedom, factions will develop. And so you have only two choices as a true government. You either get rid of individual freedoms, which he didn't want to do, or you allow the factions to grow, and you have to find some way to manage them. Right? And so what he talked about was that these factions, most of them grow out of unequal distribution of wealth or unequal distribution of property, that there will always be tension because some people have more money than others, and those things create factions or these different groups. Government must control the effects to make sure the tension doesn't get out of hand. Right? What he is suggesting is that a Republican form of government, like he designed, is the best way to do that. Right? You don't want a direct democracy where you give the masses all the power. You create a large republic in which the diverse views actually help control smaller factions from wreaking havoc on the nation as a whole. Right? He points out that these different spheres and the size of our country, right, will actually help to lend towards a more stable environment. And that, yes, factions can become problematic, but they're not to be extraordinarily feared because of the Republican form of government. Right? If you have factions within the government, he also points out this idea that the government has this system, all right, and we'll see more in later Fed papers, right, in which the branches of government can control each other. Opposed to Fed 10 was the Brutus argument. Brutus 1 is an anti-federalist essay. In Brutus, right, what our author is talking about is some of the weaknesses that they see that are going to create a government that's going to go out of control. All right? And what he's pointing out is that no politician in history has ever given up power. And he's suggesting that this Constitution is giving too much power to the federal government. So he points to the necessary and proper clause that I talked about earlier. He points to the supremacy clause in the Constitution as examples of creating a potential monster. All right, are the fears that he's talking about. And he's suggesting that the states are going to be reduced to bystanders in the political process, that they will become much weaker as the federal government grows stronger and stronger in America, right, especially with a federal court system that has the power to review all of these laws. Right, he becomes fearful. Right, one of the specific quotes that is used in Brutus that I think is worth remembering, he says in his essay, "A free republic cannot succeed over a country of such immense extent." Brutus's point was the opposite of Madison and Fed 10. He said that our large nation and its reality that it's going to continue to grow is going to become just a larger and larger problem in which the diversity of these states' views, right, will create more tension. You cannot have a government that adequately represents all of these diverse views. So Brutus's argument is these are real problems. Lastly, he says that the government, because of these tensions, if you look in the Constitution, the government now has the power to keep a standing army, and this is a real problem. The standing armies will only intimidate people from being able to express what their true thoughts are. Right? The last Federalist essay we're only going to cover in basics here is Fed 51. We'll see it more in a subsequent chapter. Fed 51, Madison again is the author of Fed 51. He highlights in much greater detail here the benefits of the separation of powers, all right, on why this document is a great document. He highlights the existence of the checks and balance system, all right, in Fed 51 with this famous quote. He says, "If men were angels, no governments would be necessary." He recognizes nobody's perfect, and so, but he says he's created a system with the separation of powers and the checks and balances to help control those imperfections. Right? Finally, some final thoughts within the chapter. They talked about how the founding fathers, even those in favor, all right, didn't always see eye to eye on exactly whether this document was perfect or not. They talked about, as a way to address anti-federalist concerns, that we should add a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights would be added 2 years after adoption as a promise that James Madison made to bring other people on board. That helps speed up the ratification process. And so for the most part, that is chapter 2. We'll see you tomorrow for the quiz.